Many years ago, in the 70s, when I was a teenager, and now the secret is out of the bag, we have my babysitter here. So, you were in the 60s, of course. In the 70s, there was a very interesting personality that came into the Chabad scene. His name was Dr. Yehuda Landis. He's a real heavy-set guy, long beard, and he used to wear those like Russian kippas. And he was from San Francisco, and he was a psychiatrist. And he had recently become attracted to Lubavitch and to religious Judaism, and he had completely turned around his life. And he had a long, at that time it was already a white beard, and he was sitting farbranging with us, which means he was telling stories to us about his life. And we were teenagers, 15, 16 years old. And what he said made such an incredible impact on me that I would like to share this with you as an introduction to this presentation. He said that I used to live in Crown Heights when I grew up, but I lived on the other side of Eastern Parkway. I don't know if anybody knows what I'm talking about, but there's the one side of Eastern Parkway where 770, the headquarters is, and then there's the other side of Eastern Parkway. Now, back in the day, in the 40s and 50s, Crown Heights was a middle upper class neighborhood with beautiful homes on President Street, doctors, lawyers, He lived with his family on the other side of Eastern Parkway. Does anybody know of the Brooklyn Jewish Center? The Brooklyn Jewish Center was a conservative synagogue right across the street from 770, and it happened to be, they later sold it, and they moved out, and I got married in that center. Rifki and I got married in that center. But he remembers the following, that he was walking on Rosh Hashanah day from the Brooklyn Jewish Center, a conservative synagogue, with his father, and they're walking along on Eastern Parkway, and they looked across the street. And there were these strange-looking, black-coated hat guys walking around because the Frierdiker Rebbe, the former Rebbe, had just moved in to 770, which used to be an old medical clinic, actually. And he remembers asking his father as a kid, who are those people? And his father told him, they're Eastern European Chasidim, and they just moved in. Give them 20 years and they're going to look like me and you. And he's sitting here telling us that, and he says, look, not only are they not looking like us, we're beginning to look like them. And he says it took him 25 years to cross the street, to go from that side of Eastern Parkway to come back. He went to San Francisco. He had to go to San Francisco to come back to cross the street and connect with the Chasidim who had just moved in to 770. And so that is who we are today. Well, it's not who we are today, but that's the reality of the Chasidim today as they came to America. But what I'd like to share with you during these few minutes that we have together is where all this comes from. Where does the dedication come from? Where does the ability to withstand the external influences and pressures come from? And what really is Chassidism, and when did it start from a historical perspective, from a historical context, and how has it been integrated to the rest of the Jewish world today and impacted it till this very day? And so I need to take you on a little historical journey back to, we're not going to go back to the beginning. I'll leave Adam and Eve for another class. We're going to go to Eastern Europe in 1648, 1649. 1648 and 1649 were the years of the infamous Bogdan Khmelnytsky Cossack rebellion. And Bogdan Khmelnytsky was a guy who was born in the Ukraine and rose up against the feudal lordships that were oppressing the people and taking advantage of the rank and file and serfs, etc., etc. But as always, whenever, like in the time of the Crusades in the 1100s, their stated purpose was to recapture Jerusalem from the Muslims, but it very quickly became a war against the Jews. And the Jewish communities were decimated in those years in the 10th and 11th century. But we're talking now the 16th, 17th century. And Bogdan Khmelnytsky whipped up a frenzy to the extent that thousands and thousands, I think it's 100,000 Jews were murdered mercilessly and cruelly in villages and towns across Eastern Europe. Devastated, complete devastation. And you can imagine coming out of that and surviving that and reestablishing yourself for those who survived was very difficult and excruciatingly painful.
What are those countries today?
Russia, Ukraine, Russia and the Ukraine, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, and Poland. Not so much Lithuania, but Russia, Poland, and the Ukraine. Mainly those three cities. Countries, excuse me. So then, some of you may have never heard of the false Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi. Right, so he comes along in 1672. 20 years, or less than 20 years after, we call it the Gzeda of Tach V'Tat, because in Hebrew, that's the equivalent of 48 and 49. 1648, 1649. So he comes along and harnesses the grief and the suffering of those years and says the time for the Messiah has arrived. And I'm not going to go in, I can give you a whole class on Shabtai Tzvi, but we're just going to mention him here in passing because he contributes to the theater of where the Baal Shem Tov emerges into.
He also became a Muslim.
But that's at the end, exactly. So Shabtai Tzvi is bringing hope and encouragement, and his excitement about him sweeps all throughout Europe. And there are many, many mainstream respected rabbis that got on board with him. There are many who didn't. To make a long story short, as you just said, it ends in disaster. The Ottoman Empire, or a Turkish Sultan, captures him and gives him a choice. Either you accept Islam or you die. And he accepted Islam. And with that, dashed the hopes of millions of Jews. And there are still, by the way, diehards who still believe in him till this very day. That was just was a little temporary aberration. He's coming back. I mean, whatever. It's irrelevant. So here you have the Jewish people devastated both spiritually and materially. And as a result, they can't afford, for the most part, to send their kids to school. Because their kids are helping them in the farm, their kids are helping them at home. They can't afford so only a select few are really getting educated. And in those days, learning was the path to privilege and status. It wasn't so much money, it was learning. If you were a scholar, you were accorded special privileges in the community. So, into this very traumatic landscape comes the Baal Shem Tov. And I'd like to tell you a quick story about his birth. And I will try to, get as much information as we can in this short time. And a lot of this is passed down as tradition. We don't know exactly where all the sources are. Some of it, as you will soon see, is really quite amazing. the Baal Shem Tov's parents were well-to-do people. His father's name was Rabbi Eliezer. His mother's name was Sarah. And they were very hospitable, very, very kind and generous people. And they would always have a big crowd at their house for Shabbat. They had a Chabad house before it became official. And one Shabbat afternoon, there's a knock on the door. There's a poor person with a knapsack, obviously just arrived on Shabbat afternoon. And in those days, to travel on Shabbat was unheard of. Unheard of. So he's violating the Shabbat, has the nerve to knock on the rabbi's door, and the rabbi welcomes him in and sits him at the table and starts to run to serve him, to make sure he's comfortable. Meanwhile, all the other people are starting to murmur to themselves, how dare this person, violate the peace of our Sabbath, and look at the rabbi, he's treating them so nicely. They couldn't understand it. But nonetheless, the rabbi persisted, and he gave his congregants, the firm look to lay back. And not only that, he stayed to the end of Shabbat. He escorted him on his way Sunday morning. He gave him provisions for the way and did not mention a word about his Sabbath violation. When the stranger turned to leave, he turned around to Rabbi Eliezer and he said that I am Elijah the prophet, disguised as a human being to test you. And you have passed the test. You and your elderly wife, they were older already, will give birth to a son who will bring comfort and joy to the Jewish people. And within the year, the Baal Shem Tov was born, and they named him Israel. And the Rebbe once said that when a person faints, you whisper their name into their ear, and it revives them. So here the collective Jewish people was in a faint. And so Yisrael, the Jewish people, was the name the Baal Shem Tov was given, because he was going to revive the spirits of the Jewish people. So he's born, and when he's 5 years old, both his parents pass away. And his father on his deathbed calls him over and says to him two things. He says, Yisrael, never fear anyone but God, and love every Jew with all your heart and soul. That was his dying words. And the community took care of Yisrael till he became 11, 12, but he always would be a very difficult kid because he didn't really have any interest in learning. He used to run into the forest, and he would love to commune in the forests where it was peaceful, and that's where he spent most of his time, and most of the people in the town just basically ignored him until he met an older man in the forest who appeared kind of out of nowhere, seemed to know who he was. And Yisrael connected with him, who was a mystic, a secret tzaddik, and he traveled with him and studied with him. Now, in today's day and age, we'd be horrified. But those were very pure, innocent times. At any rate, this little boy traveled for 3 years, learning and studying with this rabbi. Then this rabbi passed him on to another rabbi whose name was Rabbi Meir, who was one of the heads of, there was a secret group, clandestine group of mystics who took upon themselves to travel around to the villages and inspire and encourage the poor, downtrodden Jewish people of their time. And he joined that group. Not only did he join that group, he became the leader of that group when he was 14 years old, because somehow he was inspired and guided them to help to have a plan. He was very organized, and he would hire teachers to go teach the simple children of the villages. He provided for their economic opportunities by organizing farm collectives where they can work the fields and support themselves. And he gave them self-respect. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about his official emergence. Right now, he's still in training. He gets married when he's around 24 years old. He becomes a lime clay salesman. He digs clay and his wife sells it. And he also becomes an assistant to a teacher, and he takes the kids back and forth. He did carpool. He would take the kids back and forth to the houses, and he would sing with them and teach them and be with them. And those, he says, those were one of the best times of his life. One day, he is met in the forest by another individual that he doesn't know. And this individual becomes his teacher for the next 10 years. Now, I'm going to tell you who he was, but many of you will raise your eyebrows. So I'm telling you that I believe it, but I'm not going to call you a heretic if you don't. But the name of this teacher was Achia Hashiloni, who was a student of King David and a mentor to Elijah the prophet, who had come down in the form of a physical person to tutor and mentor the Baal Shem Tov. That is the tradition. And the Baal Shem Tov grew in every area of learning, of scholarship, of mysticism. It was an incredible time for him. And at the end of 10 years, he told the Baal Shem Tov that our time is up, and now it's the time for you to begin to officially open up a synagogue, gather students, and make your mark in the Jewish world. And he said, no way. He did not want to go public. He loved this life of anonymity and peace and choosing when and where he can make his mark and not having the responsibility of, being in the public. So he refused. One afternoon, while he is studying in isolation, he sees a little shepherd boy running towards him. He says, Rabbi, I'm looking all over for you. And he has a bunch of papers in his hand. And he tells the Baal Shem Tov that a little while ago, I noticed an old man put papers under the stone, and I kind of was interested to see what was going on. So I waited till he left, and I went to get the papers, and he was watching for me, waiting for me, and he says, do I not dare touch those papers? And he asked me to take those papers, and he said that there is a rabbi wandering around in this area of the forest. When you find him, give him these papers. And I'm sure that you're the one that these are intended for. What are these papers? The Baal Shem Tov takes a look at the papers, and they are a letter addressed to him by the head of all of the groups of mystics called Adam Baal Shem Tov. Reb Adam Baal Shem Tov. There was another Baal Shem Tov before Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, but of course Yisrael Baal Shem Tov is the most famous. But Adam Baal Shem Tov was his teacher, was his master. And he said to Rabbi Yisrael in this letter, the time has come for you to reveal yourself and to establish a formal synagogue. And he writes the following story in these papers. He says, many years ago, in the city of Tzfat, there was a simple, honest, God-fearing tailor. And one day, sitting in his house at night, and there's a knock on the door, and he says, who is it? And he says, Elijah the prophet. Really hadn't expected Elijah the prophet. And he goes to the door, and he opens the door. Elijah comes in and says, listen, I have been sent from heaven to reward you and tell you when the Messiah is going to come and teach you the secrets of the Kabbalah. However, I must know, what special deed did you do on the day of your bar mitzvah that that you are being rewarded for. I have to know, or else I can't stay here with you. And this simple Jew gets very angry. He says, I will never tell what I have done to anybody. It's between me and God, not even to you. And Elijah's taken aback, never been turned down before. And he goes back, and there's a big tumult in heaven that this guy is like, wow, this is very, very special. And it was decided that Elijah should come down without the condition and to teach him and to mentor him. And so he did for many, many years. And this person became probably one of the most scholarly and holy individuals in that time in the world. However, nobody knew about him. He was very private, very circumspect, very humble, and he died. They buried him in a place for the cemetery for, the paupers. So he passes away, and he comes up to heaven, and you would think that, hey, this guy's going straight to the best place. However, there's an angel there, or there's a sense that he didn't really live up to his full potential. He had all this knowledge, but nobody benefited from him. So therefore, it was decreed that this soul come back down again into this world and spend and dedicate its life helping and teaching and giving himself over to others. And Adam Baal Shem Tov says, Yisraelik, that's you. That's your soul. You must reveal yourself. You must come out into the open and do what you can do for the people of Israel. And Adam said, Adam Baal Shem Tov, that if you continue to refuse to do so, you really have no real reason to remain alive in this world. So that was the choice. So obviously Yisrael realized that his private time was up, and he settled in the city of Mezhibaj in the Ukraine. You can go visit his synagogue. In fact, I just found out that there's tax records, secular tax records of the Baal Shem Tov paying taxes to the local municipality with his name. That's incredible. I just found out about that. So anyway, the Baal Shem Tov begins to preach. And he gathers, in 6 years, he has 60 students. In 10 years, he has tens of thousands. By the way, just anecdotally and parenthetically, at the time of the Second World War, before the Holocaust, 3/4 of Eastern European Jewry were Chasidim. That's huge. People don't realize the incredible destruction for the Chasidic world, not only the Jewish world in general, that the Holocaust was. At any rate, the Baal Shem Tov attracted the simple and the most erudite scholars at the same time, because he was an incredible scholar. So people gravitated to him, but also he made his primary focus to reinvigorate, to reconnect the common rank and file Jew to their creator. And I'll just go back to what we began in the beginning of the class to give you a little bit of a picture of how alienated the simple Jew was in those days. They had separate synagogues. The scholars refused to pray with the simple people who were unlettered. They refused to interact with them. There was a chasm, a divide between the scholarly and the simple. They never interacted. They had separate social groups for each category. There was like a caste system. And as a result, the unlettered who were sincere, but they just didn't have the opportunity to learn, were completely disenfranchised from the mainstream of Judaism. And these were thousands and thousands of people. So when the Baal Shem Tov came and he declared that studying Torah, listen to this revolutionary idea, that studying Torah is not the only way you can connect to God. And if for some reason, he didn't denigrate the study of Torah is very critical. But if you did not have the opportunity to learn, to study, to know, to acquire knowledge, it doesn't mean that you and God are no longer compatible or that you're done. You have no hope of a relationship with God. What the Baal Shem Tov did is he reopened a connection and an opportunity for a simple, unlettered person to embrace Hashem, because he taught that what really counts is sincerity of heart. What really counts is where your heart is. And if you say words of Torah or Tehillim or prayers, even if you don't understand them, they are meaningful to Hashem if you're sincere. And that spread like wildfire. It electrified the Jewish people. All of a sudden, they feel connected again, re-enfranchised. They are now feeling that they have a purpose, they have a reason. And the Baal Shem Tov would say that Hashem loves you guys even perhaps more than the scholars. Because you know it's possible that your study of Torah can become a barrier between you and God, not a connector. Because if it's all about you and your pride and arrogance and it's self-centered and you're only using the Torah to acquire status, so that's not godly. And that was revolutionary, because in those days, the scholars, they were like way up there. Nobody touched them. And all of a sudden, the mainstream Torah world is feeling very threatened. Here comes this popular populist. He's preaching something we've never heard before, and tearing down all the walls between, the honor of Torah and so on and so forth. And that's why there was so much opposition to the Chasidim, because they were seen as people who are tearing down all the values that we held dear. And the truth of the matter is that the Baal Shem Tov was not doing any such thing. The Baal Shem Tov was a Torah scholar, valued Torah scholars, had thousands of them that came to him. But what he was saying is that the Torah scholars have to open up their hearts for the others, and that if you're not able to study Torah, it doesn't mean that you're lost forever. It was a revolutionary idea. He also taught that loving your fellow as yourself does not mean if they live next door to you and they drive the same cars as you and they have the same bank accounts as you. It's not a social thing, an economic thing. Loving your fellow as yourself is fundamental. It's essential. And every Jew has a neshama that pulsates with spirituality and godliness, even if they themselves are not aware of it. And he pounded this message again and again. The followers grew. People spread out all over Europe to bring his message. And he was also a miracle worker. But I can keep you here all afternoon with stories of the Baal Shem Tov. And by the way, it was so pervasive that it's acknowledged that some of these stories were made up. And so the common refrain, aphorism is if you believe every story about the Baal Shem Tov, you're a fool. And if you don't believe them, you're a heretic. So what do you have to do? So what's your position? They could have happened. I'm not sure they happened, but they could have happened. But they don't tell those stories about you and I. So some of the stories were definitely true. So he gathered his students, and he passed away in 1760. 1760, sorry about that. He was born in 1698. It was hard to pass away in 1660. But 1760, he passed. Yeah. You can believe it could have happened. So 1760, just 16 years before the American Revolution. Just think about it in terms of historical context, what's going on this part of the ocean and that part of the ocean. It's amazing. So after he passes away, so the opposition intensifies. And there's all kinds of political reasons for the opposition and all kinds of stories that are made up, and it grows. There's a lot of opposition to the Chasidic movement. And it was also, by the way, a Kabbalistic-based movement, bringing a little bit of the Ruach, the spirit, the soul of the Torah back. Because of the trauma of Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah, who based his whole career on the Kabbalah, when he went down in flames, the Kabbalah became persona non grata in the traditional Jewish world. That's off limits. So here comes another movement so soon after Shabtai Tzvi, again kind of reintroducing the study of Kabbalah, and that was another reason why so many resisted the Hasidic movement. But this was not a heretical movement. This was a movement that was only deepening and grounding the traditional Jewish life with a little bit of life, because it had become pretty stale, pretty dry. The Mezritcher Maggid, the Maggid of Mezritch, Reb Dov Ber, was one of the Baal Shem Tov's primary students, and he took over. And he moved from Mezritch, from Mezhebaj to Mezritch, and he had a group of incredibly scholarly students, and he fought the opposition during those days, but he only had a tenure of around 10 to 12 years. But he gathered the future leaders of the Hasidic dynasties of today. Because until the Maggid, Hasidism was focused in one spot. There was one Rebbe and one place. When the Maggid passed away, his students traveled, scattered. They didn't appoint one leader to keep them together. In order to spread the movement, and you know that there are hundreds of Hasidic movements, small and big, and before the Holocaust even more. Even today there are many in Israel and in New York and California, Florida. There's little pockets of different groups of Hasidim, and they all emanated from Reb Dov Ber of Mezritch, the Maggid. His students fanned out into all areas of Europe. So you have the Satmar Chasidim and the Bobover Chasidim and the Belzer Chasidim, and they're just differentiated by the kind of hat and the coat and the gartel that they wear. It's kind of, you have to really get a little book that guides you to, what clothing identifies what type of Chassid. At any rate, one of the primary students of the Maggid of Mezritch was Shner Zalman of Liadi. Shner Zalman was not, he was a Chassid, but wasn't raised in a Chassidic community. His father was Reb Baruch. It is known that his father took him to the Baal Shem Tov so the Baal Shem Tov should cut his hair on his third birthday. But the Baal Shem Tov told his father not to tell him who it is, just to tell him it's Zayda, grandfather. So the Alter Rebbe called the Baal Shem Tov Zayda for his entire life. Whenever he would quote something, he would say the Zayda said. But he doesn't really, I don't think he remembered, or maybe he remembered vaguely his trip to the Baal Shem Tov. So the Alter Rebbe was sent to Lithuania to grow the Hasidic movement in Lithuania. Now, anyone who knows anything about Lithuania in those days knows that that is the bastion of Talmudic study, the rigorous Talmudic study of those who opposed Hasidim was in Lithuania, in Vilna. There's an individual, a very great individual called the Vilna Gaon, Rebbe Eliyahu of Vilna, who led the opposition, who was the kind of the titular head of the opposition, and he was a great Kabbalist himself. And he was led to believe that the Chasidim are the worst thing that can happen to Judaism, and he was very, very, very much opposed to the Chasidic movement, and it was to that stronghold that the Alter Rebbe was sent, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi. And he also was told by his teacher to author a code of Jewish law, and then he later wrote the Tanya. But let me step back for a moment and just give you like a kind of overview sense of what the Alter Rebbe contributed to the Hasidic movement. So as you can imagine, you know the caricature of the dancing Chassid? Chassidim are really happy and dancing and effusive, and that's still true today. But back in the day, Chassidim were known to be very emotional, not as much into Torah study, and they studied Torah, but it was prayer that they were into, that they focused on. The Alter Rebbe attempted or succeeded in pulling the Hasidic movement from extreme emotionalism to the center by introducing the importance of engaging the intellect in your service of Hashem. It's, yes, the heart is important, but we've gotten too carried away with the heart. It's not all about the heart. If God would have wanted it to be all about the heart, he would not have given you a head. Since he gave you a head with a mind and a brain, he wants you to use it, and use it in the most effective way that you can. So he introduced the concept of intellectual emotions, emotions that are grounded on intellectual meditation or intellectual understanding. And he brought into full view his understanding of the intellectual process. And he identified 3 primary intellectual parts of the brain: wisdom, understanding, knowledge. Otherwise known as Chachma, wisdom, Bina, understanding, Dat, knowledge. The acrostic is Chabad. Now you know where the word Chabad comes from, and you all knew that already. I know you knew. Chabad is Chachma, Bina, and Dat, wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. And to the Alter Rebbe, it was very important that a human being, that a person employ his intellectual abilities and perceive and understand and examine and challenge whatever it is that he's learning. And especially as it relates to a relationship with God, from the Alter Rebbe's perspective, we have the ability to understand, appreciate, and meditate upon the greatness of Hashem in our life in a real sense, in real time. And this should evoke love and fear, which are the emotions of God, of a person, the emotions of a person. And that love and fear may not be as glitzy, but it's going to last. It's foundational. So the difference is between a fireworks show where it's all nice and splashy, but the next second it's out, it's done, it's over with. And so the light was intense, but it didn't last. So that's an emotional ecstasy, is like a fireworks show. But if you really want to nurture a relationship with God that is going to take you through life, you got to go through the long, short way, meaning take a little time on the front end and have it all figured out once you get to where you need to be. Meaning that if you take the time to contemplate and to meditate and to pay attention to. It will go through the various parts and components of your intellect, trickle down to your emotions, and connect you in a real way. And the Alter Rebbe explained that according to the Kabbalah, there's this notion of mibsari echze Eloka. From my flesh will I gain insight into God. We are created in the image of God. Why do we have 2 feet and 2 hands and 1 nose and 2 eyes and 2 ears? Because there is a spiritual corresponding aspect of the divine that we are created in the image of. So nowhere, God forbid, are we saying that God has these properties, but it's like genetics. You can have a gene that looks nothing like the impact it has many years later. In its gene form, it's microscopic, but it then has an impact on the color of your hair and your how tall you are and so on and so forth, and other aspects related to your health. So basically, God, every aspect of the physical world is rooted in a spiritual representative aspect corresponding to every reality that we have. And that's the same thing with male and female. Why do we have genders of male and female? I mean, before you know it, we're going to be doing away with those genders. But for now, we have male and female. Why is that? Because there's a masculine and feminine element within God. Everybody will tell you, God is not masculine. You're right, he's not. He's not feminine, he's not masculine. He's both. And none at the same time. But he has masculine properties, characteristics, and feminine properties and characteristics. And I can go, and we don't have a lot of time, but there's a whole beautiful understanding of Adam and Eve and marriage and how we are coming together and reuniting. And it's all about connecting the male and female elements of godliness. So, mibsari echse Eloka. So we'll see how chachma, wisdom, is the kernel of the idea. Bina is the analytical. So you have people that are creative, they're chachma people. People who are analytical, they're bina people. People who are very easily connect with others, they're da'at people. And that's just, very, very brief and just a sampling. There's so much more to again, we can give a whole class just on chachma, bina, and da'at. But let me wrap it up. Because as interesting as something is, how long could you sit and listen to one guy? So it's time to wrap it up. Okay. So I would like you to realize that everything that you have heard about the Chabad movement and the Rebbe, who is almost, you can say, the personification of the Baal Shem Tov, is directly related to these concepts you just heard, but just applied in modern contemporary surroundings. The Avas Yisrael, the love of a fellow, the genuine and unconditional acceptance of every single Jew into your orbit, where you're not categorizing people by where they belong or how much they do, that is a direct result of the Baal Shem Tov's concept of the sincerity and the beauty of every Jew's neshama, every Jew's soul. So in those days, it was little villages in the Ukraine, Jews who maybe kept Shabbat but didn't know what they were doing. Today, it could be extended to every single Jew, no matter how secular, how unaffiliated. You will find the love radiating from a Chabad rabbi, and I know I'm kind of tooting the Chabad horn, but after all, you're here. But I want you to gain a little appreciation of where this all comes from, and it's really real. And I want to say this. I want you to get the right idea. Even if none of you ever become completely religious or Shomer Shabbos, it doesn't mean that we've wasted our time. Because we do value every single step and every single mitzvah and every single commitment that every person makes in our communities, and it stands alone for that moment. It has value, and it's worth everything. And that is taking the Baal Shem Tov's message. And now you can see how the Baal Shem Tov's message has had such an incredible impact on the world, on the Jewish world today, throughout the world. It is being carried on and continued, and God willing, I'll conclude with this one last saying. It was the Baal Shem Tov once said that he had a vision or an experience where he was told that this attitude would ultimately bring the Mashiach. That would bring the world to redemption would be this attitude of love and acceptance. And indeed, we are getting closer, and may we all meet next year at the National Jewish Retreat in Jerusalem.
Click subscribe to see more exclusive content for the most sought-after Jewish speakers, teachers, and thinkers.